Well, good morning, and thank you for joining me for this fourth live webinar in our 12-part series on the Disclosure Scotland evolution, all that you will need to know. Thank you very much for coming today. Nice to see some familiar faces. Okay, let's just go into what we're going to be covering. I'm flying solo today. There's a lot to get through again. As always, I'll be starting with a bit of background around Disclosure Scotland and the implementation of the Act, and I'll provide a much needed overview of what's changing and then dive into some of the key points of the Act. I'll talk about what the changes mean to individuals, to employers, and to organisations, to screening companies as well, and provide some guidance on understanding the timelines and how to prepare and stay compliant, of course, as well. As usual, if you've attended some of our previous webinars, there will be some polls going on throughout the webinar to gauge some understanding and awareness. Please feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A tab. So poll number one, it's just a quick question to see how familiar you are with the Disclosure Act 2020. I'll leave this for a few more seconds before we move on, but basically nobody's very familiar, which is great. That's obviously why you're all here. So what we're talking about today is in effect all about modernising Scotland's disclosure system for better protection and rehabilitation. Disclosure Scotland was introduced in April 2002, just before the CRB, and it was initially there to support enhanced standard and basic disclosures. The only real change since then is the evolution to include the PVG scheme, which was introduced in February 2011, which goes some way to explaining why the Disclosure Scotland Act was introduced in 2020. It was enacted to modernise the Disclosure Scotland system, to make the whole process more simple, particularly for candidates, but also to streamline the reporting process as well. And we'll go into more details very shortly. But the reason for this obviously was introduced such a long time ago with so little change. It's really to provide greater control for applicants with their disclosures and their disclosure information, but also to balance up the dual requirements of protecting the public and those at risk, but also with the need for rehabilitation as well. But ultimately, it's all about addressing the need for better safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults in England. In Scotland. This is quite a comprehensive slide going over the key changes in the Disclosure Scotland 2020 Act. We'll be covering the most important elements of the Act today, and this slide I feel should be a really helpful for a summary when it comes to sharing the key points with any colleagues and or your customers. So let's start with the reduction in the number of disclosure products, or is it? Essentially, as you can see, they are moving from 4 disclosure levels to 4 disclosure levels. The little table on the right, you'll see current disclosure levels versus the disclosures from April the 1st, 2025. Level 1 is there to replace the basic level disclosure. Level 2 replaces the standard. Level 2 with barred lists is the new term for enhanced disclosures in Scotland. And the PVG scheme remains the same in terms of name, albeit with a few tweaks. Big change though with the PVG scheme, and I will mention this again, is that it's now mandatory for all regulated roles in Scotland. And sometimes there's a disparity between those getting enhanced disclosures in Scotland versus those who are requiring PVG scheme membership, but it's now mandatory for all regulated roles. Next and most timely, there is a transition, a move towards a new online account service, and that is coming soon, very soon, within the next 2 weeks. Actually, a week on Monday. They're moving to the Scot Account website, which will provide centralised access for various public services in Scotland, making it more convenient and efficient, moving away from mygov.scot, where it's currently hosted. Now, moving to the Scot Account should boast an improved user experience. See, that remains to be seen in practice, but that's certainly the plan, designed to be more user-friendly, with an intuitive interface that will simplify navigation and access to various services, not just the disclosures and PVGs. It should make it easier for users to find the information that they require and access the services they need, most importantly. But it'll also enhance security. The new Scot accounts should incorporate a lot of advanced security features to protect the individual's information, stronger authentication methods, better data protection than the mygov.scot website currently hosts. So next key change is making safeguarding PVG scheme mandatory for all regulated roles, as I said. This change enhances the privacy for individuals by limiting disclosure of the sensitive personal information that's revealed. A really important point is that The new process will allow membership to be confirmed without disclosing the detailed conviction information. So the system will still ensure that those working with vulnerable groups are appropriately vetted, but it will also respect their privacy. So the intention is that the process will be more efficient but less intrusive. There'll be an individualized, fair approach to the childhood offending disclosures as well. So basically, all childhood convictions will now be assessed on a case-by-case basis, where the context and relevance of the offences will be considered. Now, you can imagine that somebody with 2 or 3 offences 30 years ago might be viewed differently to somebody who's got 2 or 3 offences of a similar nature 3 years ago if they're only 20, so still classified as a child when the offences occurred. So it's a very different context and scenario when it comes to decision making and potential outcomes when it comes to Disclosure Scotland making those barring and disclosure decisions. Final point I really want to cover here is around the duty to refer individuals to Disclosure Scotland's barring team. And we'll look into this in more detail in the coming slides, but it really is a very, very important part of the Disclosure Scotland Act 2020. So, various stages, key dates and milestones to reflect on and also to think about going forward. So the 2020 Act, while we're talking about it today, well, so much of it is still to come into effect. So key dates, July 2020, the Act received royal assent and work started on the modernisation programme. Some more elements were introduced already just a couple of months ago, which started to make this topic topical, and those included new referral powers for local authorities and for integration boards as well, or joint boards. We'll talk about that in a moment. 18th of November 2024, I've mentioned this already, but that's a week on Monday, and that's the move to the new online account, and it will mean from that point on only paperless applications and results will be delivered. Major changes effective from April 1st, 2025. That's the big date that's trying to encourage people to start thinking about now. It is only 5 months away. This is where the core set of changes are going to come into effect. So changing those disclosure types from basics to level 1s and standards and enhanced to level 2s, etc. That all takes place on the 1st of April 2025. The scheme will become mandatory as well for PVG members as well, so not relying on enhanced disclosures anymore in Scotland. Any of those regulated roles will have to be eligible for the mandatory PVG scheme. Also, the introduction of the individualised approach to childhood offending and this legal duty to refer. It's already in place, but it's becoming a lot more robust, more enforced, and a lot more emphasis on the requirement to do it. Unfortunately, there are, I believe, hundreds of thousands of cases where individuals should have been referred to barring but haven't, and this is really what this aspect of the Act is there to address, that legal duty to refer for organisations in Scotland. Fee changes, those are also due to be brought in on the 1st of April 2025. There's been a public consultation on those fee changes. That was in May this year. Such a high number of people responded though, and they're still going through this as part of the consultation before those fee changes will be announced. Not too dissimilar to what's going on, of course, in the UK, in England and Wales with the DBS changes as well. They still haven't been announced, although they are expected. So the next key milestone will be late next year, where there'll be new powers to impose conditions on PVG scheme members who are under consideration for listing. So people who aren't on barred list yet, but under consideration. And what will happen is that anybody in that sort of scenario will have restrictions on the type of work that they're able to do and on the setting. So perhaps they're not going to be able to work in a care home or a school until that decision has been made. The key point to make on this though is that consideration for listing will include communication with the individual, but that will be Disclosure Scotland's responsibility. They will communicate with the individual when they're going through this process, so it's not going to come as a surprise or responsibility of the employer or the organisation. And finally, the transition to a time-limited PVG scheme membership. This will require a 5-year renewal rather than a life membership, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But for the meantime, which aspect of the new Disclosure Scotland Act will you find most beneficial? It'll be really interesting to see your responses to this. Quite a few to think about there, so we'll give you some time But basically, there's quite a lot of interest in the reduction of disclosure products, or the perception thereof, the introduction of the mandatory PVG scheme, and the duty to refer requirement. Yeah, I also believe that's one of the most important considerations as well. So thanks for your votes there. Right, on the next few slides, I really want to talk to you about the impact of the Disclosure Scotland Act on the three use cases, really, on individuals, on hiring organisations in Scotland, and on screening companies as well. So what does it all mean? Well, here are the key points for consideration, and then we'll just dive into the details separately. What are you going to do to prepare from an organisational perspective? There's going to be impacts on recruitment processes. You've really got to think hard and long about this duty to refer requirement and understand the implications thereof. Monitoring and compliance with all of those changes that I've already outlined. There's so much going on. How are you going to make sure that you've addressed each of the requirements going forward? The fee increases, obviously they are still to be confirmed, but they are going up across the board. There's only one price change that is not happening, and that's regards to the updates for PVGs, and then the enhanced control for applicants as well. Obviously communicating all elements of this to individuals, to colleagues, to customers, and of course the final point, the new powers for integration boards to make referrals. This is really important for safeguarding people who've set up their own healthcare arrangements, be that self-employed or directly appointed carers as well. There are new powers for those integration joint boards and councils indeed to make referrals to the Disclosure Scotland and barring scheme. So first of all, we're going to look at the impacts on individuals, the enhanced control over personal information. So this is all around the change from the GovScot to the Scot account system, everything going online. There will be clear guidance on accessing all of that information on the system. Crucially, the individuals are going to have the ability to review and dispute disclosure information before it's shared. In the same way that happens south of the border in England and Wales, they're going to be able to dispute and apply for changes before those disclosure results would be shared with the employers. There is an online disclosure dispute form available to submit those requests, or candidates can continue to write in Disclosure Scotland directly. Fairer disclosure of childhood offences, covered that somewhat already, but obviously the individuals need to perhaps be made aware that those childhood convictions will now be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and the context and relevance of those past offences are going to be a key aspect of that. I think ultimately a lot of individuals will be now eligible to take regulated activity with the introduction of this part of the Act. Obviously, the individuals are going to have to be made aware that there's no more talking about basic, standard and enhanced disclosures in Scotland anymore. They'll need to understand the difference between the level 1s, the level 2s and the level 2s with barred lists. They should be made aware that the process going forward from April 2025 is going to be much simpler and will enable quicker results to come through as well. Now, in terms of the fee changes, important to point out that there are two ways that fees can be paid, particularly when it comes to the PVG scheme. Now, in terms of the changes, fees are going to be discounted rather than waived for volunteers. So they have been free, but now we're talking about a considerable discount to the full fee rather than the fee being waived altogether. Now, the consideration here is that either the organisation can decide to pay, or they can set it up so that the individual pays for the membership and update fees themselves. So it might not be relevant to all individuals, but it'll certainly be relevant to the organisations. The other thing is that, again, fees for PVG membership are going to be discounted rather than waived for people who are eligible and in receipt of various types of benefits. All of the categories are clearly set out as part of the consultation, but it's still up for debate, I guess, until those fees have been announced. But there's also going to be an introduction of a discount for PVG fees for young carers as well. Impact on employees in Scotland. So for those organisations who are recruiting and hiring in Scotland, particularly those in regulated activities, there are all sorts of fee changes to think about. Good news, I guess, is that for the basics or the level 1s, there's going to be no change. They're remaining set at £25, or that's the proposal. But the standards and then the enhanced, they're likely to go up from £25 to £35, and those PVG registrations, the £59 that you're probably all familiar with at the moment, are going to go up to £70 and be renewed 5 yearly. Now, if we think about that, this is actually going to generate quite a considerable additional revenue for Disclosure Scotland. Instead of a one-off £59 fee for membership, they'll be able to recoup £70 every 5 years for those individuals. So that will all go towards obviously maintaining the new online system and helping Disclosure Scotland Scotland process the applications quickly and efficiently as well. As I mentioned earlier, no change to the PVG confirmations. That's a new term rather than statements. The update service, essentially, no change to the £18 fee. Now, the other impacts, of course, are going to be around getting documentation, policies, procedures up to date in line with all of those changes. Job descriptions, adverts, those are also going to have to be updated to reflect the new disclosure requirements and the legal duty to refer. This I really want to spend a little bit of time on because it's so important, not just in Scotland, England and Wales and Northern Ireland too, but in order to comply, I do believe that many organisations are going to have to train appropriate staff on their legal obligations and how to maintain those records as well. But there are clear protocols in place for referring individuals, and not just individuals who are on the PVG scheme already. It's any individual that has potentially harmed a child or a protected adult, or placed a child or protected adult at risk of harm, or displayed inappropriate behaviour involving pornography, any displayed sexual behaviour involving a child or protected adult, and indeed any individual in the workplace who's provided inappropriate medical treatment to a child or protected adult. So those are the categories whereby employers in Scotland have a legal duty to refer and report any individual to Disclosure Scotland. Hope I've made that clear enough, but this is one of the key elements of the Disclosure Act, to make sure that those people who should be considered for barring from regulated activity have the potential to go through the process, and then it's obviously up to Disclosure Scotland to decide whether or not that person is going to be considered for barring or barred. So the impact on background screening companies, I know quite a few people coming in from service providers, similar requirements in terms of just preparing for the transition to the level 1 and level 2 disclosures, ensuring compliance with the new disclosure system, and communicating those fee changes ready for the April 1st launch of the new services. I think that all background screening providers are going to have to provide clear instructions for applicants as well, and obviously helping those candidates, if they are providing a full-on service rather than just software, about how to go through the process with the new system on Scott account, and also helping them understand the review and disputes process as well, and pointing them to the new online form. When it comes to compliance and monitoring, there will need to be regular audits, of course, as they're already in place for those who are accredited bodies with Disclosure Scotland, obviously in line with all of the new changes, and updating internal practices as well. And then, of course, practically making or applying those fee changes. As part of the public consultation on fee changes, they've introduced a fee of £120 per year rather than £75 a year for umbrella bodies and accredited bodies, but there's no change to the £15 fee for adding counter signatories after the first 5 that come with that membership. So time for another poll. This one is on biggest concerns regarding the implementation of the Act. So whether you're a screening company, an individual or an organisation, what are your biggest concerns around the implementation of the Disclosure Scotland Act? Thanks for your votes. I can see that understanding the new requirements is the biggest concern for most of you at the moment, which is good. Hopefully this webinar will help address and allay any concerns. Fee changes and understanding the requirements are the main concerns, though, as you can see. Good to see some voting for the impact on current employees as well, because that's really crucial. If you've got to communicate to everybody currently on the PVG scheme in particular that next time that they want to interact with their membership, it won't be through MyGov Scott, it will be through Scott account instead. So that's great. So when it comes to implementation and compliance with the Act, the code of practice is king here. There's so much information there. We've got to make sure as responsible organisations that all of the disclosure information is used properly and lawfully. We have to give assurance to people about how their information is going to be used and the changes thereof, and obviously handling, storing and disposal of information. It's set out very clearly in the code of practice that this has to be in line with the Data Protection Act 2018 or GDPR, and that all organisations have a policy on handling, retention, storing and destruction of disclosure information. So one change that I really wanted to pull out note there is that PVG data has to be deleted when any regulated activity ceases for an organization. So that means if an individual was undertaking regulated activity for their employer, but their role changes or they leave the organization, you need to delete that PVG data that you've got on file within your organization from the records. So again, when it comes to implementation, training is going to be crucial. Informing and preparing staff around the changes. Everybody needs to know if it's going to touch on their responsibilities or duties, and make sure that all staff are fully briefed on the new rights and responsibilities from every angle as well. How can you access these Disclosure Scotland products? Well, you can either become a registered body yourselves, you can use an umbrella body, or use an accredited body or a responsible body. A lot of confusion around registered bodies and responsible bodies because they both known as RBs. I tend to use accredited bodies instead in my terminology. Ethical considerations. Yeah, this is really important as well, I believe. The recruitment of ex-offenders, this is a big theme within the Disclosure Act. It's there to ensure that people have a fair chance. And when it comes to reviewing disclosure and PVG information, you've got to, as an organization, as a hiring organization, make sure that you're applying consistency, you're applying fairness and transparency with everything that you do as well. So treating every disclosure with content on its merits, having that face-to-face meeting with the individual and being open and honest with your thinking and questioning and taking everything into consideration before making those final recruitment decisions. So quick recap of the key requirements. And if you understand all of these points and implications, I think you'll be in a really good place already. Probably a good time to mention that we've got the Q&A function as well. So feel free to get any questions in now. I can see a couple of questions there already, which is great. And any further questions, please do feel free to reach out to us directly after the webinar and we'll help you in any way that we can. But those key changes, so change of disclosure types, basics, etc. to level 1s, changes to the membership, how it's accessed, how long it lasts, etc. The whole going paperless journey as well. That moved to the new online account from November the 18th. More control for applicants over sharing of disclosure information and obviously the disclosure dispute form and that whole process. Keep banging on about this, but the legal duty to refer for organisations to try and make these regulated settings safer for vulnerable groups and for children. Those new powers for Disclosure Scotland and the new powers for the councils and integration boards in Scotland. So they now have the ability to refer for barring directly. It's not all on the organisations. And then last but not least, of course, those fee changes as well. Do keep an eye out for news. Obviously, EBC Global are very proactive in sharing regulatory news and updates, and we'll certainly be making you aware of those changes as soon as they are confirmed. I wouldn't be surprised if it's before the end of this year. Attended a webinar with Disclosure Scotland last month where they confirmed they're close to completion of the public consultation, but they were swamped with feedback from the consultation. So questions from the floor. So the first one is, can you explain the new referral powers for local authorities and integration boards and how they will enhance the safeguarding of vulnerable groups? Well, funny enough, I think this one came in before the previous slide. I will just jump back to it. This is where integration boards in Scotland and councils are able to make direct referrals themselves to Disclosure Scotland. So it's not just the organisations and their duty to refer people for barring, councils and integration boards can too. Next question was, what support and resources are available for organisations to prepare for the changes coming into effect? Obviously, beyond the contents of this deck, and we will of course send out a recording of this webinar and a blog highlighting all of the key points. Yes, sorry, I should have gone over this earlier. There's a couple of links here in the penultimate slide where you can see there's a link for Disclosure Scotland and key changes to the Act, and also the Disclosure Code of Practice. There is a wealth of information online. I think the challenge is that there's so much information, so much detail. It's really quite a challenge to condense it and bring it all into understanding, which is really why I decided that we needed to have a session on the implementation of the Disclosure Scotland Act and host this today. One final word is, of course, course, we have launched our Disclosure Scotland service to customers. The basic disclosures are live in the system and can be ordered already. And obviously, we will be changing them in time for April 1st for those level 1 disclosures as well. Last but not least, what's up next? So this was episode 4 in our webinar series. Episode 5 going to be a compliance double bill. It's all about what you need to know. The Worker Protection Act 2024, which has just come into force 26th of October. Obviously, the new era of corporate accountability and what you need to know about the failure to prevent fraud element of ECTA, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. This has been delayed. It was due to have been enacted in 2024, but I've just heard a week or so ago that's been pushed back until probably Q2 2025, which gives organizations plenty of time to prepare. But obviously the key focus of the webinar will be how vetting can protect workers and organizations and also protect themselves from penalties as well. So join me on December the 3rd for a deep dive into compliance, fraud prevention, and preventing sexual harassment in the workplace as well. But until then, thanks ever so much for attending, and keep calm, carry on vetting. Thank you.